2021. I would like just to let a couple of seconds pass so everybody can join the webinar, as this takes a couple of seconds. Good. I think everybody is joining now, has joined already. So I would like to continue for today's side event. My name is Katja Huyo, and I'm talking to you from the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. Our topic today is a decade of action to achieve universal social protection by 2030, co-organized by an impressive group of actors, and with an equally impressive lineup of speakers you will meet very soon. Let me start maybe with some more technical information before I would like to say a few words about today's topic. First of all, please note that the event will be recorded. Second, we have French and Spanish interpretation, and the interpretation can be switched on and off or changed by clicking the globe button, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom interface. During or after the presentations, feel free to post your questions in the chat box. Please do not use the box Q&A because that will be reserved for technical questions. Please use the chat function to post your questions. If possible, please post them in English and indicate to whom you direct the question, and please aim to be concise. Now, a few words about why we have chosen the topic of universal social protection during this year's HLPF, which marks the beginning of the decade of action to achieve the SDGs by 2030. The world in 2021 is facing huge global challenges, ranging from an ongoing global health crisis, global warming, persisting and rising inequalities, demographic change, migration, protracted conflicts, and political polarization, a looming fiscal and debt crisis post-pandemic, and last but not least, important transformations in the world of work with implications for employment and social protection. Against this backdrop, today's panel will speak about the importance to invest in social protection policies as a pathway to achieve a set of interrelated goals. First of all, to combat poverty and inequality. Second, very importantly, to guarantee income security and access to essential services such as health over the life cycle and in times of social contingencies or crisis, such as economic downturns or the current COVID-19 pandemic, which is stipulated in ILO conventions and recommendation 202 on social protection floors, and not the least, incorporated in SDG 1.3. Thirdly, to ensure the progressive realization of the UN human rights agenda, including the human right to social protection. Fourth, to contribute to economic growth and stability, to social reproduction and care provision, to social cohesion and participation of everyone in economic, social, political, and cultural dimensions of society. And finally, to create national and international solidarity systems which allow every person to be protected and to be safe and live a dignified life. Much has been achieved in the past, but not much needs to be done still. And the current circumstances are complex and challenging. It makes me very curious to hear what our distinguished speakers have to tell us about their experiences and recommendations. Which brings me directly to opening the first session, the contribution of universal social protection by 2020, by 2030. I will only introduce speakers very briefly and would like to ask you to refer to the event website for further details. All speakers have 6 minutes for their intervention, and I will be very strict with timekeeping to allow for a short question and answer session after each session. It is now my pleasure to invite our first distinguished speaker, Dr. Shara Razavi, Director of the Social Protection Department at the ILO, to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Katja, and let me start by thanking the organizers of this event for the invitation. I'm very honored to be part of the panel alongside my very distinguished co-panelists, and I think it's also very apt that, Katja, you're the moderator of this panel, given the valuable research that you have done at UNRISD over many years on universalism and social policy, consistently being ahead of the curve, I think I can say about UNRISD research in this area. So in June of this year, just only a few weeks ago at the International Labour Conference, the ILO constituents put forward a very clear and I think visionary understanding of universal social protection. And if you allow me, I will sort of read it out to you. Universal social protection, it says, the text of the agreed conclusion says, entails actions and measures to realize the human right to social security by progressively building and maintaining nationally appropriate social protection systems so that everyone has access to comprehensive, adequate, and sustainable protection over the life cycle in line with ILO standards. Now, I think this definition goes beyond universal access to social protection, which, though important, is clearly not enough, to also include the comprehensiveness, adequacy, and sustainability of protection. And I'd really like to use this as a jumping board as to why this kind of, if I can say, thick understanding of universalism, as opposed to a very thin understanding that only talks about access, why this kind of thick understanding is so timely at this particular moment, as we're sort of still in the midst of this crisis, and why it is so helpful in terms of helping us chart pathways out of the present crisis and in pursuit of a more inclusive future. Now, as the time is very short, I'll just kick off our panel with 3 observations. First, I think it's important to dispense with the idea that universalism is difference blind or that it entails uniformity. I think we know very well that the idea of universal rights and equality emerged as part of the Enlightenment principles in opposition to particularistic rights that were vested in castes or ethnic groups, for example. Now, while over the past few decades, women's rights advocates and advocates of other disadvantaged social groups have often criticized what they call the false universalism of policies, I think this critique does not really try to dispense with the idea of universalism, but what it does is to make sure that it is consistently applied to everyone and that it takes into account differences. So let me just be very concrete about this. For example, the fact that women tend to have more interrupted careers for various reasons, including care-related reasons, and the fact that they earn lower wages than men means that if we make pension benefits dependent on an individual's past earnings and ability to contribute to a funded pension plan, then you will end up penalizing them. Or to give another example, disability right activists, I think, have argued very persuasively that universal social protection systems need to take into account the specific needs of persons with disabilities, for example, by providing benefit levels that are adequate and higher for people with disabilities so that they can purchase or obtain access to suitable technology, whether it's a wheelchair or a software program for people who are visually impaired. And similarly, indigenous rights movements have argued that social health protection should not only make access to healthcare affordable, but also it's a responsibility of the state to ensure that frontline service providers are adequately trained in terms of anti-discrimination standards, so they treat persons, indigenous persons and other people who are marginalized with dignity and respect. So we want a kind of, we don't want a difference-blind universalism. We want a universalism that is responsive to specific circumstances and needs. I think that's very clear. Secondly, I think now that we're in the middle of this COVID pandemic, when we know that it has increased poverty and inequality and many other tragic outcomes in terms of loss of life and morbidity, we just know that the challenges of poverty and inequality are even more daunting today than they were before the pandemic. And I think in this context, and this is my second point, we really have to pay attention that the pursuit of universal social protection is critical because, as Corpi and Palme argued many, many years ago, there is a paradox to redistribution. The more countries target benefits to poor individuals and households only, the less likely they are to reduce poverty and inequality. Now, I think the arguments which have been in favor of targeting low-income people and providing flat rate benefits have focused very much on the distribution of money that's actually transferred, but it has overlooked the bigger picture, the size of the redistributive budget, which is not always fixed, necessarily fixed, and which tends to depend on the type of social protection systems that we have, which really links to a political economy logic, which shows that there's a trade-off between the extent of low-income targeting and the size of the redistributive budgets. The less likely non-poor individuals and households are to benefit from social protection, the less willing they are to pay and to sustain it. So that's why we have this, paradox of redistribution. And to increase the size of the redistributive budget, which will then lead to reduction in poverty and inequality, it's absolutely critical to expand the reach of the social protection system and not to limit it to only poor people. And my third and final point, Katja, and I will be very brief, is that it's absolutely important to generate trust between citizens and residents and the state. At this time, this should be a priority for any government that wishes to emerge from this crisis and to build a peaceful and prosperous society. And the easiest and best means to start that process of rebuilding trust in the state is through the provision of universal life cycle social protection, just as today's high-income countries did after the devastation of the Second World War. Not only do such schemes act as counter-cyclical measures by putting resources in the hands of people who are actually going to spend it, but also it will create a virtuous circle so that it can deliver greater government revenues through the willingness of everyone to pay taxes and make contributions, because everyone sees benefits from a universal social protection system. And I think this is also the logic behind ILO's two-dimensional social protection strategy, which has national social protection floors that guarantee basic levels of social protection to everyone over their life cycle, serving as a stepping stone to progressively ensuring higher levels of protection to everyone. And I will end by saying that for universal social protection is not only crucial for ILO constituents, we also have a global partnership for universal social protection, the USB 2030, which brings together countries and international organizations and civil society organizations and our social partners, and which have committed to act in line with the 5 core objective principles of this partnership, which include protection throughout the life cycle, universal coverage, national ownership, sustainable and equitable financing, and participation and social dialogue. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from our partners who are on this panel and in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shara, for these very interesting and pertinent points you raised. I immediately move on to Dr. Michael Rutkowski, Social Protection and Jobs team in the World Bank. Michael, you have the word.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon. I must say that as a co-chair of the Universal Social Protection 2030 Partnership, along with ILO and Shahra, I find this event, and we all in the World Bank find this event and the whole forum extremely timely and really in line with the USP 2030 partnership mandate and vision. It comes in a very special time because in response to the pandemic, and I think we cannot lose sight that we delve into the decade of action at a very special time where the social protection reaction to the pandemic was overwhelming. Over 220 countries and territories implemented more than 3,300 new measures in the social protection world, with cash transfers being the premier instrument used. And on the World Bank side, we really have provided an unprecedented support to many, many countries. And in social protection area alone, from March 2020 till now, we provided support exceeding $12 billion to 56 countries, with over 1 billion beneficiaries, which never happened in the history of the World Bank. And I think the pandemic was a trigger for all those things. Now, let me, in the spirit of talking about universal social protection and the decade of action, let me point to a few areas where action is particularly needed and areas where we need to talk more about in order to be able to be meaningful, not declarative, in talking about universal social protection. I think our focus has to be on enhancing the preparedness of social protection systems for future crises and enabling the resilient and inclusive recovery. This is why you will often hear from our side in the World Bank that we talk about the need to build adaptive social protection systems, the need to bridge the gap between social protection actors and humanitarian actors. We need systems that can be scaled up and scaled down quickly. This is a test of whether they are genuinely universal. Can they help people in need, even if a number of people in need grows rapidly when the crisis, natural or man-made, hits? This is critical. The second critical area, often overlooked because it is either too technical or too techy, is the need to focus on delivery systems. We need to leverage technology. We need to expand the access to the systems, including knowing who the intended beneficiaries are and to make sure the benefits go to intended beneficiaries. This is why you hear often from us that we do need social registries to better link services to those who are in need, to cover informal sector workers, those who were the most hit in the pandemic. We also be emphasizing the need to accompany any cash support with other measures. Some call it graduation, we call it economic inclusion, coaching, mentoring, asset transfers. These are all accompanying measures which should be seen as an integral part of social protection systems, services. And this is the way to promote resilience and to allow those the most hit, the poorest and most vulnerable to earn sustainable livelihood. And as it was put many years ago by Bragg, graduate from being poor and vulnerable, we would say being economically included. Let me also really emphasize that they need to focus on the informal workers, on the elderly and people with disabilities. We need to have a very keen eye on those groups that are particularly vulnerable and that would in normal course of events not be able to benefit from social protection systems. That would be really lead us to a big call for much better domestic resource mobilization in order to be able to finance social protection systems. It will lead us to thinking about how to reform subsidy systems and tax systems in order to improve domestic resource mobilization. That also is a call for overseas development assistance to be smarter and not to be in a situation in which 90–95% of social protection system in some countries are financed by foreign aid that is not a sustainable system. Going towards the summary, I wanted to say two things in closing. I think the first would be cheerful, the other would be a bit of a warning. The cheerful part is that really, this is a right moment to focus. There is no time for complacency to achieve universal coverage and to make systems adaptive, sustainable, and relevant to the changing nature of work in a post-COVID world. This does require bold vision. It does require greater and smarter investment. It does require broad-based partnerships. And this is all of those are within our collective reach. And it is so fantastic that we are here together. We put our brains and hearts together to this issue. The warning part is as follows. We need to be fully aware. We cannot just, cheer up and be enthusiastic. It's not good enough. We need to be keenly aware of difficulties and trade-offs. So the call for action is also a call for seriousness on understanding them. Let me give you an example at a very general level. Shahra shared with us the definition of universal social protection, which we fully share. And there is a mention of three aspects of this universality: access, comprehensiveness, and sustainability. Access, many people accessing; comprehensiveness, not just cash transfers, not just social assistance, the whole set: social insurance, social assistance, labor market policies; sustainability, that in the long term, the system can be financially and socially and economically sustainable. We need to be aware of the trade-offs. This is a bit like a famous welfare triangle. If you build a system that has access there and is sustainable, there is difficulty with comprehensiveness. If you build a system that has an access and is also comprehensive, it will not be easy to make it sustainable. And if you build a system that is really sustainable and also comprehensive, all kinds of risks are covered, well, in that case, it can happen that many people will have difficulty in accessing it. So unless we will be very serious, we are very serious about those trade-offs, and we are able to debate them in good faith, which we are, I'm sure, then our contribution to the progress on this very important path towards universal social protection would be slower than otherwise it might be. So I would like to wish all of us maintaining enthusiasm and collective spirit while having a very keen eye on trade-offs and difficulties, because plenty of them lie ahead of us. Thank you again for inviting me to this very important event. I will be very pleased to stay for questions, answers, and the rest of the event with all of you. Thank you, and over.
Thank you very much, Michael, for introducing us to the very important approaches and priorities of the World Bank, and also, for that call of joint action and partnerships. I move on to our third speaker in this session, Dr. Maliki, Director, Poverty Alleviation and Community Empowerment at Bappenas, the Ministry of National Development Planning in Indonesia. Maliki, the word is yours.
Thank you, Katja. First of all, I would like to thank and appreciate for Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection, USP 2030. It has been 3 fruitful years for our involvement as one of the members of the steering committee. Indonesia, as representative from lower middle income countries, perceive our involvement in the global partnerships is very important. The partnership has supported us through sharing experiences, especially overcoming the challenges to achieve our ultimate goals, which is all population is protected by more comprehensive and also integrated social protection system. So in this regards, we would love to share how actually Indonesia has achieved quite a big jump in poverty reductions in the last 3 years, just before the pandemic COVID. Yeah. Because just before it, we have reached single-digit poverty rates in 2018, with extreme poverty around 4.6%. This achievement became a very strong base for our achieving the SDGs target in 2030. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, because of this achievement as well, our president directed our ministers to formulate strategic planning to achieve zero extreme poverty in 2024. This is 6 years earlier than has been scheduled in SDGs goal 1 by 2030. The outbreak of novel coronavirus threatens Indonesia, as well as I think the whole countries in the world. And also it is like threatens our entire gain in poverty alleviation achievement. This is undoing years of positive trends in poverty reductions and also jeopardizing the targets of SDGs. COVID-19 pandemic has declined the economic growth due to the large-scale constraints on people's physical mobility. The declining of economic activities hurts the poor and vulnerable the most, especially the informal sectors, people with disability, as well as the elderly. So there are important lessons learned during this pandemic of it, but there are two significant important lessons learned for us. First is that we still have challenges to identify the eligible households or individuals to receive the assistance. We have actually by name, by address beneficiaries registry established almost 10 years ago. However, last complete and also comprehensive update was in 2015. There were challenges for local government to systematically update the data. So the experience during the pandemic of it has prompted the government to increase the coverage of the households in our unified database for social protection programs. We are planning to registering the names and addresses not only for poor and vulnerable households, but also lower middle class households. So in the future, we are looking forward to develop the whole population socio-economic registry. This is include all vulnerable groups, such as the informality workers, these people with disability, neglected children, and also the older person. And second, which is the more also is quite essential, is that we identify that more adaptive scheme of social protections is crucial to respond natural shocks or social shocks such as pandemic. So as part of our social economic reform, we are looking forward for establishing adaptive social protection. Thank you for the global partnership and also GIZ for supporting us to enrich our national concept. This actually also includes the support from the World Bank as well as the UN family. So in the future, Indonesia social protection will be consisting more adaptive and more focused social assistance, comprehensive and also nation coverage social insurance, and also stronger social services. Our social assistance will be targeted based on the vulnerability in the future. So we will strengthen our referral system for a rapid response and on-demand application. To conclude, the crisis has shown that accurate data are needed. Social registry could be a solution to comprehensively assess the individual social economic status, which help the government of Indonesia to formulate the right strategies, policies, and programs of social protection, especially to the poorest people, to ensure that they receive assistance as well as services they need, and also to accelerate the target to zero extreme poverty by 2024. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maliki, for sharing your lessons and insights as being part of the steering committee of USP 2030 and from the perspective of Indonesia. I would like to move on to our next speaker, Roshni Nijehali from the organization Wadana Todo Abhiyan from India, on behalf of the global call for action against poverty and on behalf of the Global Coalition. Roshni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katya. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I think it's an honor to be here on behalf of GCAP India as well as Wadana Todo speaking on this panel. And I think before I start, just to once again ground the conversation today, social protection is a human right. We are talking about redistribution. Most countries are adopting a life cycle approach. However, even despite all the work that has been done over the last decades, only 29% have comprehensive social protection. That's 5.2 billion people are only partially covered. And I think if these figures weren't staggering enough, just as we stepped into the decade of action in 2020, COVID struck, and we have, what Arundhati Roy called, was an X-ray in the context of India at least, and all countries revealing all that is wrong. The World Bank says that about 120 million more people are living in poverty as a result of the pandemic. And it's not just the lower income countries now, it's even the middle income countries like India and Nigeria and the new poor that are caused due to the pandemic and these absolute numbers are really high. So, and of course, like Dr. Mikhail already spoke, in response to these shocks, governments turned to social protection. Just in India in 2020, India announced a US $260 billion package, which was later decentralized as well across the country. So clearly, as if the discourse for universal social protection had already gained traction before 2020, but in the context of the pandemic, there can be no doubt that really now is the time for a huge push towards universal social protection. And why universal? Dr. Shahara put it very eloquently, because it's not just for the poor. Even the lower income groups, even people within the formal sectors are all affected by the pandemic, and we really need to push for this across the world. So it makes economic, social, political, and moral sense to really look at universal social protection. Of course, there's a lot of, we know we need the basic floors as well as a robust social insurance system. However, there are risks as well, reducing employer contributions, for instance, through taxation. Privatization of social insurance. This is a conversation that has happened. Some countries have retracted, but these conversations still exist. And something that Isabel Ortiz has studied in great detail is this austerity wave that we are likely to see, not the COVID waves, but the austerity wave that is predicting that, in the next 2 to 3 years, over 159 countries will see public expenditure cuts, which is going to affect 85% of the world's population. So I think we have several options to make universal social protection a reality, as long as we are aware of these risks, which are very real, and continue to emphasize on reaching the most marginalized. And I think I want to draw your attention now to a few of these areas of specific focus in the context of universal social protection towards removing of inequalities, which are very unbearable within and throughout the world. The things I want to talk about are groups that are invisible in the policy making space, the issue of data, and the issue of technology. When I say invisible groups, I'm just going to talk about 3. Of course, there are several, but I really want to focus today on migrants who are primarily working in the informal sector, women and others along the gender continuum, and youth. Migrants and informal sector workers, they make the majority of working populations across the world. And you all would have heard of the exodus of migrants from cities to rural areas, which happened in India over the last year. So I think what we need right now is specific, contextual, and long-term measures of social protection for informal sector workers, not just immediate in response to the pandemic. This includes income support, healthcare, food, and housing support. Also look at things like the gig economy, part-time jobs, the fluid forms of employment which are growing. So what happens to protections in these sorts of employment? I think that's important. And to reach the most marginalized, we need to improve administrative procedures, but also working closely with civil society and unions to ensure that the most marginalized are reached in the sector of informality of work. I'll move into the gender, and we see that women and others along the gender continuum are being left out of several traditional measures. We know many women are home-based workers. They miss all the safety nets, and more so after the pandemic. Just in India, huge reductions in numbers of women working in the workforce because of the pandemic. So we need to prioritize gender alongside traditional worker-centric and disability-centric benefits. We need to look at cash transfers not as temporary fixes, but as transformational. Look at social protection that responds to sexual reproductive healthcare needs, also to gender-based violence. Looking at healthcare and helping women to ease the entry requirements for women into healthcare. So I think that's another important area. Also briefly touching about young people, most countries in the global south have young populations. And in order for us to derive benefits in quotes from the demographic dividend, there is an urgent need to make social protection respond to the situation of young people. Just in India, 10 million girls are at risk of dropping out of school because of the pandemic, malnutrition, immunization. So for young people, along with employment programs, we need to integrate social protection. That's housing, sexual reproductive health, and so on. I think these invisible groups need to center our conversation. I want to briefly touch upon data, because as we know, for any universal social protection system, data is central. But what we really want as civil society are bottom-up data processes, right? Using data to push for accountability by civil society. Because otherwise, if data is very centralized, it does risk profiling. Certain groups only will benefit, certain groups won't. It has tendency to become politicized. So really look at data to support bottom-up processes, which is also part of the Agenda 2030. Briefly to talk about technology, again, any conversation on social protection will include technology. I think 2 questions is when to use technology and where. Technology is an enabler. It should not be driving the process, right? It has to come downstream. Where technology exists as a substitute for political will, the whole process caves in. We are seeing that in India. So the moment when technology comes in is paramount, and where to use it. Our experience shows that the last mile to improve access and outreach is where it's most important. But we are seeing governments using it as a centralizing mechanism, which is ironical, but true. So we do need technology for visibilization to ensure social protection, but not for surveillance. And currently technology is claiming to do the former, but often ends up doing the latter. And I think, we can maybe discuss more in the conversation. So for inequality reduction, I think looking at invisible groups, which will be contextual across the world, as well as data and technology, are very critical. And as civil society groups, we must adopt both a systemic and a systematic method, national, local levels, identify gaps in the systems, use data for mapping the needs, recommend ideal systems, look at technology as an enabler, suggest financing mechanisms, and link with global partnerships such as the Global Fund and others. And I think if we focus on this, we can truly make this transformational dream of universal social protection a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roshni, for bringing in this civil society perspective to our first panel. And I think we now have the chance, as everyone was very disciplined with time, and thank you very much for that, to just raise a couple of questions from the audience that was posted in the chat. And I would really welcome the panelists to come in if you would like to answer that question, because the questions were not targeted at any particular panelist. So for example, one question is related to the need of capacity building in that area of universalizing social protection. And I think it could be interesting to hear both from the World Bank and from ILO, what type of activities and initiatives you actually have, in the field of capacity building. Maybe Michael, if you would like to come in first.
Thank you very much. Capacity building is critical. I refer to the fact that in many African countries, there is a almost total dependence on foreign assistance. And I think the elements of building capacity are as follows. One, I also referred to, we have sometimes other actors, notably humanitarian, operating parallel systems. And as we all understand, it may be needed in certain circumstances, much more needs to be done to mainstream them, to work together, humanitarians, social protection actors, so they are mainstream in the government. The humanitarian assistance uses government systems or is used to strengthen government system. That's the first element, which is critical. The second element is leveraging technology, which is helping the governments to use digital forms to deliver social protection to intended beneficiaries. This is the agenda which entails something absolutely critical: identification for development and G2P, government to people payments. We put a lot of emphasis in modern modes of delivery, and that ranges from good dynamic social registries. By dynamic, I mean we don't wait for census swaps. There is an ability to renew the database and have new people enrolled and old people disenrolled, old meaning not needing anymore. And this dynamic system needs to be there. Another really focus area of capacity building. We do a lot of peer-to-peer learning. We have the so-called South-South Learning Forum, which for us is extremely important because we notice countries learn better from colleagues in similar circumstances. So having government-to-government learning is fundamental for capacity building. We are committed in the bank actually to strengthen the platform through which governments can directly communicate with each other and share the best experience and the newest developments. At this moment, the platform like that does not exist, that a minister in a given country can instantly learn. Like, I would be interested if Dr. Maliki wants to learn what happened last week in Brazil. Is that possible? How easily is to be done? We would like to be of help so that it's done instantly, easily with low transaction costs. A very important element for capacity building, so it doesn't rest on telephone calls between ministers. I just hit a few important areas, but I think the most critical of them is investing in modern digital delivery systems so that intended beneficiaries are reached, and we put a lot of emphasis both through our grants and our loans and technical assistance financed by us and by other sources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Shara, would you like to come in also with some of the ILO initiatives, and maybe also linking over to, hearing Michael Michael talking about, you know, the importance of technology, and having, you know, Rashmi talking about, you know, also these kind of pitfalls, you know, of using in a way technology, you know, in delivering or identifying beneficiaries, etc. Maybe you can also speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katja. First, on the capacity building issues, I couldn't emphasize enough how important this is in terms of the work that we do. And maybe just I'll highlight 2 points that I think are quite important. One, you know, we've Roshni, Mikhail, Dr. Maliki, everyone else has kind of really emphasized the importance of bringing into the work on social protection all of the groups of workers in the informal economy who are being left out, you know, the missing middle, as we all like to refer to these groups, who often are not poor enough to qualify for these targeted assistance measures, nor have they been perhaps sufficiently in all countries included in the kind of social insurance systems. And here I think that it's really important to be working with the representatives of these workers to the extent that we have trade unions as representing them. We have also some civil society organizations that are representing specific groups of informal workers. And so it's really important when we do the national social protection strategies, which is something that, you know, ILO supports at the national level, working with social security institutions, but also with the social partners, with the workers' organizations, as well as with employers' organizations, in really being able to define the plan for each country, the national social protection strategy, how it should be taking place over the next few years, what the priorities are, what the costing that we help countries do in terms of how much it would cost to put a certain social protection floor in place, also what the financing strategies should be. And this is really work that has to include all of these different partners and bring them around the table. So this kind of capacity building for civil society organizations, but particularly for social partners and national institutions, social security institutions, is absolutely key. The other area where ILO has been quite active now, working with the Universal Coalition for Social Protection, as well as with UNICEF, is on trying to expand the conversation on social protection beyond the social protection institutions and our social partners, but also include the ministries of finance. And I know this is some work that Andres has also been doing, to really make the discussion about financing of social protection a discussion that includes actors who set the macroeconomic framework for countries, and not to be only speaking to people who work on social protection in a kind of sectoral way. We really need to have that conversation as across government ministries, including the economic ministries, ministries of finance, ministries of national planning. And this work that is ongoing now in a number of countries and where support is being given is absolutely critical. So on the issue of technology, I think it's really important to highlight that it has been a very important innovation in many countries, the way in which digital technologies have been used during this crisis to really try and make sure that people are being included, and that the delivery of benefits is done in a way that is in line with the social distancing measures that countries had to put forward. And digital technologies were a very important a sort of tool, if you like, for making this available. But we should also be very aware that digital technologies always also carry the risk of exclusion, especially among groups who are digitally illiterate, among those who are unbanked, who don't have a mobile phone, who don't have SIM cards, who may not have access to the internet, or even formal IDs. And so I think we have to be very conscious that in using digital technologies, we also really don't reinforce a double exclusion of those who are already excluded by making sure that there is explicit effort being made to put in place additional non-digital options and comprehensive and complementary support services. And also, I think the point that Roshni made is really important. There's always a risk of growing surveillance that can really infringe on the human right to privacy and to data protection, especially in contexts where state accountability is weak. You know, in other words, we have to make sure that we don't go a step further in making citizens, especially social protection recipients more visible to their governments and to big tech companies, but not the other way around. You know, we also need to make sure that states are in this context. Technology is also being used to reinforce state accountability to right holders. So I think this is a really important question, and we should be concerned about the way in which digital technologies can be used for purposes of surveillance in ways that go contrary to human rights. And I think this is a really important area. I'm sure Olivier will have maybe something to say about this as well, but his previous predecessor, Philip Alston, has also issued some really interesting report on this topic, which I think we should all be paying attention to. Thank you very much, Katja.
Thanks a lot, Shara, also for these responses. I would like to ask two additional questions that came up in the chat, and I kind of summarized them also, and would like to ask Dr. Maliki on two questions that came up from our audience. One was on, you know, how social protection interventions can really address, you know, poverty, starvation, and hunger arising during this pandemic. And maybe you can tell us a little bit from you know, the experience of Indonesia, you know, how these problems were tackled in your country. And then there was a second, you know, very specific question to you, you know, from the audience, asking, you know, given the importance of social protection, social services, and also social insurance, you know, in the strategies of the Indonesian government, whether Indonesia would also kind of champion, you know, the social protection theme in international and regional fora, for example, the G20.
Okay, thank you for the questions. So first on the starvations, I guess. Actually during the pandemic COVID, we already have established two types of the social assistance. One is on conditional cash transfers. This is actually, we learned from the Brazilians as well as all the Latin American countries on this conditional cash transfers. We call it program Keluarga Harapan. So this is conditional based on for the children as well as the women, the pregnant women, and we also add on these programs to people with disability and also the elderly. So we basically provide the cash transfers. In addition to the cash transfers during the pandemic COVID, we also expand the food assistance program through what we call Sembako program Sembako. This food assistance is actually we also use the technology. We are transferring the money to the accounts which is created what we call in groups. Yeah, it's not individually, but it is through the individual accounts. The money is transferred to the account to their individual account, but then they it's like a voucher. So they buy the food from the merchants, the local merchants, according to the procedure, according to the limitation. So we allow them to buy like rice as well as the protein sources such as chicken meat, also the cow meat, the fish, as well as the eggs. But you know, usually the poor people always like choose rice and also the eggs. Yeah, I think that's also quite enough for them. But I think these programs is quite supported their consumption during the pandemic COVID. In addition to the Sembako, we also create one special assistance for those who doesn't receive both programs. So this is like a cash transfers to says like the vulnerable to a bit middle towards middle income groups. So that I think that they also hit very hard during the pandemic COVID, especially the informal sectors. So this is I mean, during the pandemic COVID, we already have some we expand the social protections until at least like 50 to 55% of the whole populations. And then on the G20, yes, indeed. I mean, during the pandemic COVID, we experiences that the importance of the data, especially like during the first week of the pandemic COVID hit us. There is so huge effect on the informal sectors. And then there's a lot of also like the vulnerable peoples that work in the informal sector, such as the people with disability. Usually they work in, you know, like a massage services and other like type of services that really hit hard by the pandemic COVID. But we don't have the data. So this is quite unlucky for us. Then we need to have like an extra effort to collect the data for those vulnerable, not only like the people with disability, but also like homeless people, neglected children, the elderly as well, especially during the vaccinations of the elderly. So this is one very hard lesson learned for us. So it makes us planning to have like, we need to expand the data. And then we need to have like more inclusive social protections. So then in the future, not only like we include the data of the vulnerable peoples and we update their conditions, but also we need to create the on-demand application when those vulnerable doesn't receive the proper assistance. Then I think there's supposed to be a mechanisms that they will receive it. And one thing, I'm just wondering about the capacity buildings, because I think the capacity building is not only like, you know, like in class buildings, in class programs, but actually the most important learned from me in the social protection or the global partnership is that sharing session, sharing experiences between the countries as well as the experts. This is makes a lot of like insights that we can put in our policy in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maliki. I would like to ask one final question to Roshni, and that is also, you know, two questions that came up in, you know, from the audience, and maybe you can, you know, answer based on your particular context in India, as I know that civil society organizations are all discussing these issues very intensively. One question is on resource constraints and how countries, you know, with limited resources can actually mobilize these for social protection. And the other is a question, very interesting question, which also goes into the direction of the trade-offs Michael had mentioned between coherence between economic and social policies. So very often we try to fix in a way with social policy what economic policy has messed up. So there are certain contradictions of what the economic system produces and then what the social system tries to mend. So what are your thoughts on this from your particular context?
Sure, thank you, Katya. I mean, I think in terms of the first question, the resources, I think we should not let our countries hide behind the fact that there aren't resources. I mean, there are several options. We can improve tax revenues. We can use reserves. I think reallocating a public expenditure is one, you know, huge thing. Do we need so much money for defense, for instance? And in India, for instance, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which has been running for over a decade, is basically, you know, actually, and we are using that money to spend on public infrastructure. So it's almost cyclical. You don't have to separately make other public infrastructure. So there are several options. Our food subsidy scheme as well is quite vast just in terms of absolute numbers. So I think there are several fiscal measures that can be used. And of course, aid and, you know, humanitarian assistance is always an option. Maybe not so much relevant for India, but definitely for other countries. But I think we need to push through that wall, which I think is more of a, it's an imaginary wall. I think there are definitely options if we decide, if the political will is there. The other question also, I think it's ideological, maybe / philosophical. I think we need to do work on both areas. While we will continue to challenge neoliberalism and, you know, post all of that and the way in which the economic model is pushing people into poverty. I mean, that's why we do have inequality. While we work on that, I think we need to simultaneously also look at at the social protection and the social policy space. I don't think it's either or. And even if the economic growth models are perfect, it wouldn't mean that social protection is not needed, because we do see robust social protection as enhancing growth and development. So I think we need to work on both, and that's the challenge that civil society has. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these responses. And I'm glad we could have this first initial Q&A session, which has been truly interesting. Sorry for those questions that I couldn't take up, and for not being able to mentioning all the names of those who have asked the question, but in trying to summarize, synthesize, and pulling the questions together, I have chosen this kind of very pragmatic approach. So now I have the pleasure to move on to our second session, which is on partnerships for joint action. Again, I would like to ask the presenters to limit their intervention to 6 minutes. And I would like to give the word to Uziel Twagilimana from Inspire West Africa, who is also speaking on behalf of the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors on the topic of the strength of national social dialogue to build universal social protection. So Uziel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator, for giving me the floor. And thanks for inviting the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, as well as the International Network of Social Protection Rights. The presentation I'm going to make is around the strength of national social dialogue and institutionalized dialogue, social dialogue for universal social protection. Regarding the context, I can talk a little bit about the Global Coalition on Social Protection, which is a member of USP 2030 that people have talked about, but also whose membership comprise more than 100 civil society organizations and trade union organizations, such as the ITUC, OPED, Oxfam, and the others, and our own organization, whose main objective is to promote universal social protection, including IR02 on social protection floors. The concept of social dialogue, as you know, all of them, versus institutionalized dialogue. Social dialogue concerns all forms of consultation, negotiation, and exchange of information with actors that are either tripartite or bipartite, with trade unions, employers organizations, government that's being tripartite or bipartite, through social partners that employers and trade union organizations, either at company, sector level. As far as international dialogue is concerned, there is broad participation of civil society organizations and trade unions around social economy issues and policies, including social protection. And this institutionalized dialogue requires multi-actor. That means trade union, health organization, social economy initiative, elderly, the youth, informal economy, many organizations and civil society members come into this institutionalized dialogue. We have a very good example in a project that is co-implemented by ILO, UNICEF, and the Global Coalition of Social Protection Floor in 18 countries, and including Senegal. And this gives us a very good opportunity for institutionalized dialogue. Through this project, we manage, there is complementarity and synergy among the three actors for universal social protection, right-based, sensitive to gender, to handicap, and respecting the approach of life cycle. Some CSOs involved are broad-based, that is the Inspire, a network, a thematic network of 17 umbrella organizations of civil society in Senegal. There are other CSOs, the platform of NGO, the elderly platform, the handicapped people platform, the taxi drivers in Dakar, they are called Jakarta, people from Indonesia will excuse me, the Women Association, Informal Economy, all of those representing the missing needle. And also there are some international NGOs such as ours. The relevance of involving civil society and trade union in this project is that there is a complementarity of expertise among the various civil society organizations that are working on different aspects of social protection, be it preventive, promotive, protective, or even transformative. There is credibility and legitimacy given their representativity and sustainability of their initiative. And also they develop concrete services targeting the extension of social protection. Some of those services, when you talk about Senegal Trade Union, for instance, they facilitate the access to social security system labor rights through organization, sensitization, facilitation of affiliation to the system of social security. Also facilitate promoting income generating activity with some solidarity self-managed fund, and also the aspect of health and safety at work. While mutual health organizations have developed initiatives facilitating accessibility to healthcare at affordable cost. And also they developed some work of education, including on hygiene, family planning, reproductive sexual rights, and also education to prevent the spread of the pandemic, such as this COVID-19, or the other years, it was the other disease like HIV. What are the strategy of the Global Coalition consists? First of all, research, knowledge development and sharing at national level, but also among the countries on various continents. Training and capacity building, communication, a watchdog role for inclusive governance and accountability, and also lobby advocacy for, let's say, 3 topics. First of all, it's a legal framework to institutionalize social protection in Senegal. Secondly, to get sustainable financial capacity of the country through national resource mobilization, how to increase the fiscal space. Thirdly, it's the involvement of social movements in all policy elaboration, monitoring, and evaluation. What have been the achievements so far? First of all, we have managed to bring together several CSOs which did not work together before. Now they have a shared vision, shared analysis, make a power mapping analysis on sustainable funding, for instance. We have organized several workshops on public finance management, program-oriented budgeting, options for financing social protection, referring to a study that has been realized by the ILO. Also, we have identified some issues of advocacy, and the position paper are in the process of being elaborated so as to start advocacy. In our perspective, we think that social protection should not be perceived as a cost, but as an investment. As CSO and trade union, and as stated also in SDG 17 on partnership, it's only through tripolar model where business, government, and civil society, broad civil society, work together and have institutionalized dialogue at local, national, and even international level with better coordination and coherence of policies that we can achieve universal social protection for all. Secondly, trade union and civil society organization members should not be perceived as passive recipient of charity. No, they are entitled to rights. They should be perceived as true actors and reinforced. We also have noticed that it's only through cooperation and solidarity that we can cope with such a pandemic and such as COVID-19. And later on, let's work to scale up the initiative developed by civil society organizations and trade unions around the continents and across various continents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uziel, for this powerful call for cooperation, solidarity, and for explaining how important institutionalized dialogue, but also very inclusive and comprehensive dialogue that talks with marginalized groups, with academics, experts, and social movements is crucial to move our social protection agenda forward. Let me now turn to our next speaker, Excellency Erika Reffler, Secretary of Social Policy in the Ministry of Social Development in Argentina. She will talk to us about the opportunities of a strong global partnership for universal social protection. Thank you very much for joining us from Argentina, and the floor is yours, Erica.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Buenos días.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I will be talking about the main guidelines of social protection during the pandemic. And having listened to all my colleagues, I've been thinking about all the different challenges that we're facing and how to strengthen our social protection system. First of all, there are 45 million inhabitants in Argentina, and we've been living a very complex social situation. GDP had declined, inflation had risen, and poverty and social vulnerability had growth as well. This has made the COVID pandemic a more serious problem, as well as other existing issues. Therefore, this government is trying to put everything into order, everything to do with social protection, in order to face this situation. Everything that has to do with this health emergency, this COVID emergency, just as other countries have been doing. By the second semester of 2020, poverty as well affected children and adolescents. Therefore, we've been working on reinforcing everything that has to do with helping children and adolescents, especially those who are living in a situation of poverty. Historically, Argentina has always had a relatively strong social protection program with a very important outreach. It covers almost the whole population. The current program covers 94% approximately of our children and adolescents, including both the tax and not taxed system. So we could say that this system is an institution already, but we do need to strengthen it. And we need to protect the more vulnerable. That's why in 2020, when the pandemic struck us, we implemented some measures related to the universal child allocation. This targets children and adolescents whose parents are living a situation of informal work or are unemployed. And thanks to this, we managed to increase income, and through some bonds as well, we managed to fight off the situation in 2020, obviously knowing that income had fallen. We also created an emergency family income, which helped almost 9 million people, again in this situation of reduced income. And this helped sustain the incomes of many homes. There's another key axis, which Argentina has already been implementing, and I'm talking about the food policy. We've been helping around 11 million people, and there are two key features. First of all, something that is called the food card. This is something that helps children and adolescents those who are living in, who are facing, who are living in a vulnerable position, but also it targets schools, institutions, and all of these institutions that provide aid in vulnerable areas and vulnerable families. There is another key axis, and this is the informal sector, sectors of the social economy. And this is where we're working very hard. We're working on a cash transfer program. Argentina has such tradition of implementing massive programs with more than 1 million people involved who receive this aid. This way, we've been transforming these strategies, these projects, but also making sure that people can find a job and improve their income. There is a significant group of women that we've been working with. These programs have been targeting them, but also there is a community program. Dr. Razabi, I'm sure you've heard from her before. I was reading what she wrote, and she was talking about this idea of transforming a plan and linking it to different activities, different work activities, targeting these women who are already part of some programs. Because first of all, the work situation needs to be improved. But secondly, everything that has to do with the community, such as food halls, communal gardens. These are normally led by women from these popular sectors. This is why our support is not only related to income, but also including them in the agenda and strengthening the care line. Also, everything that has to do with looking after children and strengthening all these programs that target children, all the communal sectors. This targets children up to 6 years old. We had already been working on this, but during the pandemic, we made a more significant effort. But we understand that we need to keep on working on this. We need to extend our cover. We still have a lot of demand, and we need to address this. And we also need to improve our agenda regarding our education system. Okay, so there are 3 challenges in terms of strengthening social protection. First of all, vertical and horizontal coordination, national organizations and federal organizations of social protection, especially a country like Argentina, where there are different jurisdictions. We need to coordinate the nation with the provinces. Then we also need to strengthen our information systems. This is what my colleague from the World Bank was talking about. We need to identify these people correctly, and we need to monitor public policies and protection systems. And thirdly, this should be part of our future agenda as well, but the present, and this is gender, including care, violence, women's autonomy. These three are the three key topics in order to strengthen social protection by 2030. Thank you very much, and I hope that I didn't use too much of the time.
Gracias, Erika, por compartir esa experiencia desde Argentina.
Thank you very much, Erika, for sharing this experience with us. This country can teach us many things.
I would like to turn now to our next distinguished speaker, Professor Olivier de Schutter, who is UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And he will speak to us on how a global fund for social protection will enable social protection coverage for those left furthest behind. Olivier, you have the floor.
Thank you, Katja, and good afternoon, good morning to all. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me say I enjoyed very much the exchanges on the first panel, not least because I'm preparing for next year a report on social protection, a reality check to examine the reasons between the gap between legal coverage and effective coverage under social protection schemes adopted by countries, looking at issues such as corruption, non-take-up of rights, or informality of work. And I benefited a lot from these comments. We are now in a panel on partnerships for joint action, and I will be extremely short because I know we are running out of time, to simply highlight that one of the most, in my view, exciting developments in recent months has been a renewed interest in increasing international support in favor of the establishment of social protection floors in developing countries and in low-income countries in particular. That was the topic inter alia of a report I presented on 30th of June at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and it was part of the deliberations that took place at the last International Labour Conference that Shara Razavi already mentioned, referred to, explaining how important it was to have the International Labour Conference adopt a very ambitious view of universal social protection floors based on access, comprehensiveness, adequacy, sustainability as key characteristics. The Global Fund for Social Protection idea is one that I can summarize by saying it is built on five convictions. Number one, if we want governments to establish rights-based standing social protection floors, providing people with entitlements people may claim, that requires predictability in funding, whether this funding comes from the mobilization of domestic resources or whether this funding comes from the international support that countries may count upon. And the idea of the Global Fund for Social Protection is that countries need, when they face an important financing gap, they need some international support in order to encourage them to invest in social protection floors and to put this at the top of the political priorities. And we can provide this predictable multi-year funding they need in order to kickstart the process of improving the coverage and expanding the coverage of social protection floors. That is number one. Number two, increased international support by a new international financial facility is not a substitute for the mobilization of domestic resources. And I think Michal Rutkowski from the World Bank was absolutely right that mobilizing domestic resources for social protection financing is absolutely vital. We all know that such mobilization takes time. It requires capacity building. It requires to close the loopholes of taxation schemes and so on. But the key point is this: if we invest in social protection, it is an investment that can have very important positive returns for the economy and have a multiplier effect on the local economy, allowing more revenues to be collected domestically. And that is in part the point that Udzil Tswagil-Mana was making for the Global Coalition on Social Protection Floors. So it's not just a cost, except in purely accounting terms in the short term. It's an investment in an inclusive economy that can allow the country to mobilize more resources to finance social protection. The third point is that we need to realize that it is affordable to support low-income countries to invest in social protection floors. And I won't bore you with many figures, but the one figure I would like to mention is the calculation by the International Labour Organization that the financing gap for low-income countries, 711 million people, to reach the full population in these countries with the full social protection floors is $79 billion per year. One half of official development assistance provided in 2020, 0.13% of the gross national income of OECD countries. Now, of course, ODA should not be the only source of funding for this global fund, but it could be one part of the funding and one that is important, especially if we identify other funding sources. That is number three. Number four, the Global Fund for Social Protection does not mean that we will superimpose on countries one particular model of social protection. National ownership can be fully preserved, indeed enhanced, by organizing in those countries assessment-based national dialogues, bringing together social partners, all the ministries, including the finance ministry, international partners, and civil society. And by this, you can create a process in which gaps in social protection are identified and the ways forward defined. Fifth and finally, I would say that the Global Fund does not need us to reinvent the wheel or to put up a new bureaucracy that will duplicate existing systems. The Partnership USP 2030, the ILO flagship program on social protection floors for all, and other existing mechanisms, as shown in the report I presented to the Human Rights Council, can be built upon, made to work together more effectively, provided better resources that they can invest in encouraging countries to invest in social protection. And that is, in a nutshell, the idea of the Global Fund for Social Protection. And I'm extremely grateful that a large number of actors, including many governments, have now expressed an interest in this idea, have supported the conclusions of the International Labour Conference that request that concrete proposals be presented to the governing body of the ILO in November of this year for the action plan of the ILO 2021-2026 to be adopted that will be implementing this promise. Many thanks. You are muted.
We do not hear you, Katja.
I'm very sorry. It always happens. Many thanks, Olivier, for introducing us to the very important initiative of the Global Fund for Social Protection, specifically also from a human rights perspective and as a contribution to this, to the Universal Social Protection Initiative 2030. And it's very good news to hear also that the International Labour Conference has incorporated it in its conclusion, which allows me now to introduce our last speaker on this panel, Ms. Catherine Gigant, Head of Unit, Social Development in the Federal Public Service Foreign Affairs and Development Corporation of Belgium. And Catherine will present to us some comments and reactions on the initiative of a Global Fund for Social Protection. Catherine, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Katja. Thank you. Je vais essayer de parler lentement comme on a demandé. Ok. Tout d'abord, je remercie donc les organisateurs divers et nombreux pour la tenue de la
for
conférence.
this event.
J'entends en même temps l'interprète. Je ne sais pas l'interprète, c'est normal, mais ce n'est pas grave. Donc,
Chère madame, je me permets de vous conseiller de mettre l'interprétation sur le canal français. De cette manière, vous ne m'entendrez pas.
Ah ben voilà.
Si vous allez sur interprétation français. Merci.
OK.
Apologies, we had a quick technical issue.
Je vais prendre ici 3 mots-clés qui sont une
I will now take 3 keywords which are here in reaction to the idea of the Global Fund on social protection and which Belgium wishes to implement. First of all, many speakers have said, so we are in a momentum. We are also 9 months after the first mention of the proposal of a Global Fund for Social Protection. We would have needed the invisible word, but in the end we had the terrifying hand of the pandemic to support more than ever the idea of a creation of such a fund. We know that populations and government need to digest, need to learn from the risks and the shocks which they undergo. And Professor Olivier Scoudin has said so. There is also a vision which is more and more shared, and which we wish to support this vision, to say that we wish to place development of social protection basis as fundamental guarantees to react to the social sanitary shocks as well as environmental shocks. We could say that it is now or never, as some people have said. Now the time is to have a pillar of resistance and resilience to poverty and the fragility of states. Secondly, and I'll get back to this important notion of investment, which has been mentioned before, which seems absolutely fundamental. The special rapporteur has said so as well. We do not just spend, we also gain in stability, we gain in augmenting educational rates, etc. As Belgium has always said, we feel that by investing in health and sexual and reproductive health, we feel that this truly has an impact on the international, on the in the gross internal product. And to say that we are in softer issues, but we know that investing in humans is not that bad, and it actually is profitable on the short and the medium and long run. And a third issue which we feel is important as defenders of multilateralism, and as they ask about the coherence and the organization of the multilateral system in its ensemble. The UN system, as we know it for several decades, has an added value, which we've clearly seen these past few years, and we wish, as Belgium, we wish for the efficiency of the UN system to be a long-term objective as well as a stable reality. And therefore, the structure that is currently proposed in the report is an important discussion because, as we said, it draws from existing platforms and entities. It is for us as if all of the bricks that shape the House of Social Protection, at least those were still a bit unequal, and we're trying to have a common ground, a common shape to all of these pieces so that we may ideally circulate, and that there will be a sense of circulation and functioning that may be coherent. In this sense, we feel that everyone has to do their work. Some countries which have defended the basis for social protection have always been heard that it is also our job to make sure that coherence exists between the various entities. Another issues that seem important is the sustainability and the financing of this social fund. We must be realistic in terms of the elements that are being proposed in the mobilization of national resources. This has been said a number of times. This is truly important. What do we see? We see that stakeholders which are linked are not just national governments or United Nations agencies. We are in a series of processes which are much wider, and that make it so that stakeholders are all involved. We must eliminate illicit financial flows with the introduction of a tarification on carbon sources, and we must have a system to lighten the debt. We must have a number of steps for consensus and conviction. We need creation of a coalition that needs to be led. I'd like to also say that Belgium wishes to sustain basis for social protection. We've done an element of support which is raised towards a flagship for social protection of the ILO. A number of Belgian NGOs are working about decent work, and the Minister for Cooperation, Marianne Kittier, has also asked the agency for the Agency of Belgium Execution, Enable, to develop a strategy which was called the thematic portfolio that for social protection that will focus on 3 countries in Central Africa, which are DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda. So the long-term objective is to improve life conditions, resilience of most vulnerable populations in the Great Lake regions by investing in the social protection system. And we also have a more specific objective for women and young people who are still in age to get employment, so that they may be able to have access to decent employment. The strategy is currently being built. It is an ongoing process, and we have not reinvented the wheel on this matter. There are 5 strategic axes, and the first 4 axes are the 4th pillar of decent work that you all know too well.
Qui concernait l'apprentissage. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut apprendre au niveau régional?
We also decided to add another axe which had to do with learning, and what can we learn on one side and the other in this regard. I will be very brief. I would like to say, let us all continue working on the creation of the Global Fund, but I think each of our level, governments, civil society, social partners, multi-stakeholders, let us continue dialoguing, let us continue moving forward with different elements. Thank you very much. Fruitful dialogue such as the one we had today is very useful.
For this intervention, also for giving the examples, which I think already answer some of the questions I've seen in the chat about what can actually be concretely done. For example, to reach and identify vulnerable groups in this difficult situation and extend social protection to them. We are over time already, and we would like to have some questions and also a concluding wrap up by myself. And in this sense, I would like to ask participants and also panelists if they would agree to go beyond our schedule by 10 minutes approximately, and give the chance to ask 1 or 2 questions. I might not be able to get to every one of you, but would like to have that opportunity. And those who have to leave, you know, I would already say thank you very much, and apologies for going over. There are a couple of interesting questions in the chat, and you know, one is going back to the issue of coherence between you know, economic and social policies. And also about, you know, how to actually coordinate sometimes not only between different ministries, as could be, you know, Ministry of Welfare, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economics, but also to coordinate between different levels of government. There was a comment by a colleague from Pakistan, you know, mentioning that often implementation of social protection happens actually at the provincial level or at the municipal level, but often the policy debates, of course, they happen at the federal level. And I would like actually to direct that question to Erica, who has also specifically mentioned the challenge, you know, of coordinating, you know, these comprehensive and complex, you know, social protection responses, which cut across a lot of actors, organizations, and ministries. Please be very short in the answer, given the time limitations.
Gracias, Katia.
Thank you, Katia. I would focus my answer in the need to strengthen the local government as the territorial actor that is capable of coordinating policies at different levels, and especially at a federal level. Particularly, Argentina has a situation that in which there's a capacity of financing national levels, but local governments don't have. And I think that in the agenda that we are proposing and the agenda that cooperation organisms are proposing, are multilateral organisms, it's necessary to think of tools to help local governments, because that's where the public policy implementation occurs. That is why I think it is necessary to put that in the agenda and also work on concrete tools to strengthen and to plan, and above all to stay vigilant of the policies, especially with territorial coverage. I think that the agenda goes that way. We have this experience in different lines of policy, of programs, especially in order to generate coordination mechanisms with municipal governments, also addressing the diversity that is found within Argentina. I could go on, but I want to be brief.
Erika. I have another
Thank you,
question
Erika.
For Olivier, and that is a question, I summarize it a little bit, of how can we actually use a global social protection fund as something different from traditional aid mechanisms, channeling money from the north to the south, but really having this fund also as something, that has a dialogue, back and forth between north and south, includes knowledge exchange, capacity building, etc. Olivier, if you could come in. I don't know whether we have him still here.
I saw that, I think it was written, Olivier has
Maybe
to
he
leave.
had to leave. Maybe he had to leave.
Yes.
Okay. Then maybe Catherine, if you would like to
yes,
come in.
on this point, it's a good question. I think that using the already existing platform, maybe it's having a deck, un toit, I don't know the name in English, it could be useful. So you are not doing or get something new, but this kind of platform, as we're speaking here, the people who are present, the USP 2030. So we already have this kind of platform. So maybe, and to have in a different way than North and South, is the conviction that what each country is doing is good for the people. So I think in bilateral also meeting, we can have it to convince, but it's a difficult question, I must say.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for chipping in and for providing us with your thoughts on this. I would like to wrap up and give a couple of concluding remarks of what has been an amazing discussion. We always have too little time, but let me just pick out some of the many important issues that were raised during our 2 sessions today. First of all, I think what is clear that presenters and participants have made it very clear that we are at a turning point at the start of the decade of action, given the magnitude and scope of problems and challenges, and the fact that achieved gains are now under threat, as we heard both from Argentina and from Indonesia, and we know from other places, even in countries with relatively well-developed social protection systems. So we now need bold and coordinated action involving local, national, and global actors, as well as civil society, youth organizations, social partners, experts, and international organizations. And in order to fulfill the promise of Agenda 2030 for sustainable development, to leave no one behind and reach the furthest behind first, we need to create universal and comprehensive social protection systems and social services, which are of quality, which reach difficult to cover groups, such as informal workers, migrants and refugees, homeless persons, persons living in poverty and in remote areas, persons with disabilities, with health problems, etc. What we haven't discussed, but what comes out and is in a way an underlying theme in our discussion is, in order to reach the furthest behind first, we require to apply an intersectional lens, which identifies also overlapping and compounding inequalities, such as gender, race or ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, disability, etc. And this intersectional lens, should be used bearing in mind its roots in feminist economics and critical theory, as well as in social movements, rather than just using it in order to tick off boxes of who is most deserving. Social protection is a human right. We have heard it from almost most panelists, and providing universal quality social protection is the best instrument to rebuild trust and strong relationships between citizens and the state. We have also heard that we need to improve in preparing for the next crisis, in linking social protection and humanitarian action, you know, in being ready to adapt quickly to crisis in terms of our social protection programs, scaling them up or down, in terms of delivery, and in terms of using technology wisely to reach our beneficiaries. We have also heard that domestic resource mobilization is crucial, that might involve a strong collaboration, actually in dialogue between, you know, ministries of finance, ministries of the economy, and social policy, in order to improve the coherence between these very important policy fields that have a crucial impact on sustainable development. And then alongside national efforts, which, as we heard, especially from our civil society speakers, but also obviously from ILO, you know, we need these national efforts to be rooted in social dialogue. But we need to maybe expand also this social dialogue, you know, beyond the tripartite and the social partners, to also include youth and migrants and unpaid care providers, communities and social movements, you know, and debate with all these groups about how we want to shape a better future and how to build that trust and social cohesion that we need, you know, in order to agree on a way forward. And a strengthened multilateral system, and I would say, you know, this global partnership is part of these multilateral efforts, is needed to regulate the global economy, the trade finance and investment regimes, you know, to make them fair and conducive to sustainable development. We also heard that capacity building is key, which is not only about, you know, creating the capacities at the national level, but also at the international level, you know, to design and implement and deliver on social protection, but also to have this very inclusive and global debate of sharing experience and learning from each other. And I think this event has been one of these, you know, key learning experiences where we could hear from different actors in different countries, you know, of what are the challenges, but also what are they doing and how they use their creativity and their resources actually to promote the right to social protection. We heard that legal frameworks are important, but very much also fiscal space, information system, registries, and the coordination between different government levels. We heard about the importance of gender issues and of, you know, the entire debate about difference and, you know, having, you know, promoting universalism, but not being blind to difference, and also, you know, to empower and introduce affirmative action for those groups that are most left behind and most discriminated against. Two global initiatives were at the core of our discussion: the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection, for knowledge exchange, mutual support and global action, and the Global Fund for Social Protection as a much needed financing instrument to help countries in the Global South to invest in social protection. I would like to end by emphasizing, you know, that a lot of the interventions actually referred to the importance to create, to discuss, and to rebuild a new social contract. And this is also a debate that we have in our institution, and where we have launched an initiative, you know, on a new ecological social contract. And this new social contract actually needs to be grounded in universal social protection and in economic policies which are sustainable, but it also needs to address climate crisis and environmental destruction, and it needs to rebuild trust in our national and global political system. And this is why, you know, the organizers of the event would very much like to invite governments and other organizations to join the Global Partnership for Universal Social Protection 2030, and to advocate and support social policies which are not only crucial to overcome the pandemic, but to build resilient, sustainable, and inclusive societies in the future. So I would like to thank you, to extend a warm thank you to our excellent panelists, to the organizers of this event, the technical support, team, the interpreters, and many others who have helped to organize this, and of course to our engaged audience and all your questions you have raised and your contributions. So thank you very much. Apologies for going beyond the scheduled time, and hope to see you soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Au revoir.
Goodbye. Au revoir. Merci.
Goodbye.